He needed someone to boil beans and keep the stove lit. What arrived instead were three women in torn coats, sacks tied over their heads like secrets. The snow was thick, the sun dying, and nothing about this was right. The knock came long after dusk, long after the chopping stopped and the wolves had gone silent for the night. Mason Creed was wiping the last of the axe oil off his hands when he heard it. 3 soft taps, not the kind of knock from someone who wanted to talk. The kind meant to test if there was still life on the other side of the door. He didn't answer right away. He'd lived in the pines long enough to know that nothing good ever came knocking after dark. But the knock came again, quicker, sharper than a voice, a woman's too low to make out words. He reached for the rifle leaning beside the hearth, slid it into his grip with the same ease he used for his axe. He didn't open the door fully, just enough to let the barrel poke through. "Who's there?" The woman didn't flinch, didn't step back. She stood still, her hands clasped in front of her like she was waiting to be judged. Behind her stood 2 others, smaller, each with burlap sacks tied over their heads like makeshift veils. No horses, no luggage beyond the threadbare cloth bags clutched tight to their sides. "We came for the cook job," the first woman said, her voice even and tired. "From the notice." Mason blinked. "You're late." "The man who promised us passage left us 2 towns back," she said. "We walked the last 14 miles. Mason stepped out then, just enough to feel the cold bite his skin. His boots crunched against the frost. The snow reached past their ankles, the women's hems stiff with it. One of the girls coughed, sharp and wet, but didn't lift her head. "You didn't say there'd be 3, he muttered. The first woman straightened her spine. "You didn't say we couldn't bring others." Mason narrowed his eyes. "I said cook, not orphanage." "Only one of us cooks," she said. "The others, they've nowhere else." Something in the way she said it, the pause between her words, the way her voice clipped when it came to nowhere, made Mason's grip on the rifle ease just slightly. He looked at the girls, at their shoes, cracked leather, wrapped in cloth. One was shivering, the other hadn't moved at all. "You'll freeze out here," he muttered. Then, with a grunt, turned and opened the door wider. He didn't wait to see if they'd follow. He simply stepped back inside, placed the rifle on its rack, and tossed another log onto the fire. The women filed in behind him, quiet as ghosts. The warmth hit them like a blow. Mason saw the girl who'd been silent almost buckle. "You can take those off," he said, nodding toward the sacks. But none of them moved. The first woman stepped forward instead, setting her cloth bag on the table. "We won't be trouble. You've got our word." Mason didn't answer. He didn't trust people who came with too many words. He studied her. She was older than he'd first guessed, probably near 30. Her face was pale from cold, but her eyes were sharp, too sharp for someone who just walked through 2 days of snow. He pointed to the stove. "If you're the cook, start cooking." She nodded once and moved without another word. The bag held dried beans, a few onions, a wedge of butter gone soft. She worked like someone used to being watched, fast but careful. The 2 girls stood near the hearth, hands still wrapped tight, faces still covered. Mason dropped into his chair and watched. After an hour, the smell of food had filled the cabin. He hadn't eaten anything proper in days, just dry biscuit and smoked meat. When she handed him the bowl, he took it without thanks. He ate in silence while she stood, waiting. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Junie," she said. "That's Ruthie, and the quiet one's called May." He glanced at the girls again. "Why the sacks?" "They don't want to be seen." Mason stopped chewing. "Why?" Junie hesitated. "Because last time they were, someone tried to sell them." The room went still. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. Mason set the bowl down. "Explain." Junie met his eyes. "We came from a place that don't deserve its name anymore. Used to be decent folks there. Then the fire started. Then the men stopped listening to law. You posted a notice. We came. That's all we're asking you to see." He didn't like it. Not the way they stood. not the way they didn't flinch when he asked questions, like they'd already been through worse than anything a man like him could throw. He leaned back in the chair, arms crossed, and stared at the fire. "Fine," he muttered. "1 week you cook, they stay out of trouble." Junie gave a short nod. "That's all we ask." The next morning, Mason found the cabin cleaner than it had been in months. Junie had scrubbed the boards, boiled new coffee, patched the window quilt without asking. Ruthie had collected kindling. May, still silent, was feeding the hens by hand. He told himself it was just because they needed shelter, but by dusk he'd caught himself listening for Junie's voice, watching the way May moved without sound, and once he saw Ruthie pick up his axe, not to steal, but to examine it with something like respect. She'd set it back down gently. They weren't here to rob him, but they were hiding something. That night he found a cloth-wrapped bundle under the floorboard near the hearth. Not money, not food. A gun, small, clean, oiled. And beside it, a folded paper. A name written in ink. Simon Vance. He didn't touch either, just closed the board back down and waited till morning. When Junie came to stoke the fire, he asked, "Who's Vance?" Her face didn't change, but her hands stilled, then slowly resumed their work. "A man who used to own people," she said. Mason stared at her. "You kill him?" "Not yet." He didn't press, not that day. But at night he dreamed of fire, of girls with sacks over their heads, of men with hands like rope and teeth like knives. By the third morning, Ruthie began speaking. Just little things, "Thank you, yes sir, no sir." May still hadn't said a word, but Mason noticed something different in her now. The way her eyes scanned the tree line, like she expected someone to come. He asked Junie if they had kin. "They had kin," she said, her voice low. "He's the reason we wear sacks now." Mason felt something split in him. Anger, maybe, or sorrow he thought he buried with his own past. He'd lost a brother to fire, a mother to cold, a wife to the silence that followed war. He'd come to the mountains because he thought the world was finished with him. But now it was knocking again, and it wore sacks on its head. He didn't ask Junie more about Vance. Didn't need to. Because that night, long after the girls were asleep, she sat across from him at the table and said, "He knows we're gone." Mason didn't speak. "He'll come for us." This time, Mason nodded. "Let him," he said. Junie looked at him for a long time, then finally let out a breath that sounded like something breaking loose. "You don't know what he's capable of." "I don't care," Mason replied. The wind howled against the shutters, and for a moment the fire flared high, throwing their shadows long across the cabin wall. The sacks stayed near the hearth, 3 ghosts waiting. Junie's voice barely carried. "You'll be in danger." "I've been in danger since I started breathing," he muttered. "So let's see what happens when he walks into my woods." And outside, in the black belly of the forest, something watched. It started with the smoke. Not from the hearth or the stove. This smoke came from the ridge. Thin at first, like the breath of something old stirring beneath the snow, but Mason saw it for what it was the moment he stepped onto the porch. Someone had built a fire less than half a mile east. No one passed through that part of the ridge without a reason, and no traveler would risk sleeping outside in that weather unless they had something to prove or someone to find. He didn't mention it to Junie. Not yet. He watched her scrub the skillet after breakfast, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, arms strong from years of surviving. Ruthie sorted lentils into piles, by size, not color, and hummed to herself like a girl younger than her burdened eyes. May still hadn't spoken, but she'd begun to draw in the ash by the stove with a stick, soft lines that looked like homes and barns, and, once, a man on a horse whose eyes she blackened out. Mason waited until dusk to make his move. He didn't take the rifle. If whoever had come was watching, he didn't want them spooked. He hiked the ridge with nothing but a lantern and a skinning knife, his breath white in the air, boots breaking clean tracks in the crusted snow. He found the fire after 20 minutes, still warm, surrounded by boot prints, 3 sets, no ash from food, no signs of rest, just heat, purpose. They were scouting. He didn't go back down right away. He circled the perimeter of the fire, then moved toward the bluff above his cabin. From there he could see it, his home, nothing more than a thumbprint of light in a vast sea of dark. Smoke curled from the chimney, and behind that glow were 3 women he'd let in without knowing what he was inviting. He should have felt regret. He didn't. When he came back down, Junie was waiting for him on the porch. "I saw your tracks," she said. "You went east." "I did." "Then you saw it." Mason said nothing. Junie rubbed her hands together. "How long do we have?" "A day, maybe 2. He's taking his time." Junie swallowed. "He always does." Inside, Ruthie had fallen asleep with her head on the table. May sat beside her, braiding twine with quick fingers, her drawings erased. Junie glanced through the window and lowered her voice. "Simon won't come in guns blazing," she said. "That's not how he works. He likes to watch first, to find what a person's afraid of and bleed it." "He'll come to the door?" Mason asked. "No," Junie said. "He'll come to the edge of the tree line and he'll wait." Mason frowned. "Wait for what?" "For someone to run." Junie stepped back, her face unreadable. Mason didn't stop her. They both knew what this was now, something not just about escape or safety, but reckoning. He hadn't asked for it, but he didn't plan on turning away from it either. That night he stayed up by the fire, knife in his hand, watching shadows crawl across the floor. At one point he thought he heard something out back, a twig snapping under weight, but when he stepped outside nothing moved. No wind, no tracks. Just silence. And that was worse than noise. By morning May refused to eat. She sat curled on the hearthstone, knees to her chest, face still hidden. Ruthie tried coaxing her with porridge. Junie tried humming the old tune she once sang in her mother's kitchen. Nothing worked. "She knows," Junie said quietly. "She always knows when he's near." Mason thought of the smoke, of the prints circling the fire like a noose tightening. He thought of the last name in the ledger beneath the floorboard, Simon Vance, and how much damage a man like that could do with nothing but a calm voice and a long reach. "Tell me what he did," Mason said. Junie didn't look up. Her hand stayed on the washboard, scrubbing with a fury that made her knuckles bleed. "He didn't just trade in people," she said. "He made them forget who they were, broke them apart until they'd swear they came to him willingly. May was the last. He kept her longest. I got Ruthie out, but May, she was barely speaking when we found her again." "Found her?" Junie nodded. "Left in a cellar beneath a burned-out saloon, sack over her head, rope at her wrists." Mason stared at the flames, and he just let her go. "She escaped," Junie said. "He didn't know at first. When he found out, he swore he'd bring her back, said she owed him." "Owed him what?" Her silence. Mason rose and walked out to the barn. The chickens stirred as he passed. The snow had frozen into brittle crusts along the fence rails. He looked to the ridge. The smoke was gone. He went back inside. "He's moving," he said. Junie nodded. "He always does just before the storm hits." That evening, Ruthie came to him while he was stacking wood by the hearth. "I remember something," she whispered. He paused. He kept a little silver whistle, said it was how he signaled the others. When he blew it, one of them would come, always just one. Then he'd pick who went. Mason didn't speak. "I think he'll use it again," she added. "He likes routine. Said routine made people easier to manage." Mason wrapped his fingers around the axe handle tighter. When the storm hit, it came fast and without warning. Snow blew sideways, coating windows in ice. Trees cracked in the wind. The fire roared like it wanted to leap out of the stone. May began to rock again. Ruthie sang softly. Junie nailed blankets over the windows. Then through the gale, they heard it. Not a knock, not a voice, but a single sharp whistle. It lasted 2 seconds, no more. Junie froze. May pressed herself tighter against the wall. Ruthie began to cry. Mason stepped to the door and bolted it, then the back one, then every shutter. He poured water in a pot and tossed it on the floor. If someone crossed the boards, he'd see their wet footprints. He grabbed the rifle, loaded it, and stood at the window watching. No movement. But the wind howled louder, like it was carrying voices on its back. Junie came to him. He'll wait until we think he's gone. I know, Mason said. That's why we don't sleep tonight. They stayed awake till the fire burned low. Every creak of the house made the girls flinch. Once they heard boots crunching snow, then nothing. Mason finally stood. I'm going out there. No, Junie said. That's what he wants. Then let him want. She grabbed his wrist. If you go out there and don't come back, what happens to us? He looked at her, really looked, and in that moment he saw the cost in her eyes, the years of running, the fear that turned muscle to stone and kindness to armor. I'll come back, he said. He slipped out the back, snow stinging his eyes. The wind ripped at his coat. He crouched low, moving along the barn, then around the far side of the shed. He saw them then, 2 figures near the wood line. One held a lantern, the other held something smaller. A silver whistle. Mason leveled the rifle, heart pounding. But before he could pull the trigger, the wind died. Not all of it. Just enough for him to hear what the second man was saying. Take the small one first. Leave the mute, she's no use. Mason didn't wait. He fired. The man with the whistle dropped. The lantern bearer ran, slipping in the snow, but Mason chased him, tackled him behind a rock outcrop. They struggled, fists slamming into wet earth, boots scraping for leverage. Mason slammed his elbow into the man's throat and the body went limp. He stood, breath heaving, snow melting against his skin. The one with the whistle was still alive, shot through the shoulder. Mason dragged him back to the cabin. When Junie saw the man's face, she didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She walked up and hit him across the jaw with a piece of firewood. You came too late, she whispered. The man smiled through blood. So did you. Mason bound him, tossed him into the cellar and bolted the door. Then he turned to Junie. What do we do now? He asked. Her eyes were cold. Now we make him talk. He didn't scream, not even when Mason twisted the cloth tighter around his wounded shoulder. Didn't spit, didn't beg. He just stared at Junie like he'd already memorized the worst parts of her and now waited for the rest to fall apart. Mason had seen killers before, eyes hollowed out from what they'd done. But this one, this man, his eyes weren't empty. They were full of belief that what he was doing was right. That women like Junie, girls like May and Ruthie were his to take back. That no amount of snow or wilderness or bloodied rope could change that. He's not going to talk, Mason muttered, rising from his crouch. He's not scared of pain. Junie didn't blink. He's scared of silence. Mason didn't understand at first, but then Junie stepped forward, slow and measured, like the room itself belonged to her now. She didn't hit him again, didn't raise her voice. She simply said, you know what she remembers, May. The man's mouth twitched. She remembers your boots, Junie said. How they creaked just before the cellar door opened. She told me. She draws them in ash sometimes. That heel click, she says it came with the worst parts, every time you brought someone new down. Still nothing, but Mason saw it now, the flicker behind the man's composure. She remembers the whistle too, Junie said, but you know what scared her more than that sound? She leaned in close enough Mason saw the knuckles on the man's fists tighten. She remembers the quiet after, Junie whispered, the part where no one came, when you locked the door again, when the crying stopped. Finally the man blinked, once, then again, but Junie had already turned. I don't need him to talk, she said. He's just the leash. Simon's still out there. Mason stepped outside without a word. The snow had slowed, now falling soft as dust, but the air was heavier. He knew what it meant. The first one always came ahead, to mark the place, to send word back. Simon was on his way. Inside, the girls had stayed close to the stove all morning. Ruthie was sewing again, long, careful stitches that reminded Mason too much of sutures. May wasn't drawing anymore. She sat with her arms wrapped tight around her knees, her eyes never leaving the cellar door. That afternoon, Mason checked the traps. Rabbits, 2 of them fresh. It gave him something to do, something that wasn't watching the snow or listening to the cellar floor creak under every shift of the prisoner's weight. When he brought the rabbits in, Ruthie offered to help skin them. Mason didn't stop her. She moved with practiced hands, eyes down, silent. I used to do this back home, she said softly. Mason paused, before Junie. Ruthie nodded. Mama taught me, said if I could feed myself, I'd never have to say thank you to the wrong kind of man. He didn't know what to say to that, so he just let her work. The stew they made was thick, savory, something close to comfort, but no one really ate, not even Ruthie. That night, Junie took first watch. Mason told her he'd relieve her by midnight. But when he woke at 11, the house was too quiet. He found her sitting on the porch, arms folded, her eyes red from wind or memory or both. He sent you, didn't he? She asked without turning. Mason blinked. What? Vance, he found someone like you before. Said a man alone in the woods was easier to manipulate. All you had to do was pretend to be kind. Mason didn't answer. He didn't have to, she sighed. Sorry, Junie whispered. It's just, this is the part where it usually falls apart, right before the storm really comes. Mason sat beside her. I didn't take you in out of charity, he said. I did it because something in your eyes looked like mine, like someone who's already lost everything once and still got up the next day. Junie looked at him then, really looked, and now. He didn't smile. Now I'm tired of pretending the world outside these woods can fix itself. She nodded, then said something he didn't expect. We could leave. Mason turned. Tonight, take the horses, go deeper into the forest. There are places even Vance wouldn't follow. But Mason shook his head. And when he finds the next cabin, the next girl. They sat in silence after that. Long enough for the snow to build in little drifts on the porch rail, long enough for Ruthie to appear behind the door, eyes still sleepy. I had a dream, she said. Junie rose quickly, wrapping the blanket tighter around the girl's shoulders. Ruthie looked up at Mason. He comes when it's quietest, she said. That was all. But it was enough. The next morning, the man in the cellar was dead. Mason found him slumped against the wall, his face blue-gray, his lips crusted with blood. Poison. He searched his coat, his boots, even his gums, but the method didn't matter, only the message. He'd rather die than talk, Mason muttered. Junie stood in the doorway, eyes dry. It means Simon's clothes. By midday the trees stopped moving, no birds, no rustle of wind. And then the tracks. Boot prints, 2 sets, coming from the north tree line, no attempt to hide them. Mason called the girls in, bolted every door. This is it, he said. Ruthie sat with a knife in her lap. May still hadn't spoken. Junie loaded the rifle herself. You sure? Mason asked. She nodded. Your hand's steadier than mine anyway, she said. Always has been. The first knock came at dusk. Not loud, just deliberate. Then a voice. Evening, Mason. The name shouldn't have startled him, but it did. Didn't know you kept company now. Mason stood near the door, gun resting against the wall. Junie stood behind the table, eyes fixed forward. Ruthie clutched the knife tighter. "You gonna open up?" the voice called again. Mason moved toward the window. The man outside stood tall, clean coat, gloves, dark leather. He held no weapon, but two others stood just behind him, one with a blade, the other with a sack. Junie stepped forward, rifle raised. "We don't want you here." The man smiled. "Didn't ask what you wanted, Junie." Mason opened the window just enough to speak. "She's not going back. She belongs to me." "No," Mason said, "she doesn't." Simon Vance didn't flinch. "Then you just declared a war." Junie fired. The bullet missed on purpose, striking the snow inches from his feet. Simon didn't blink. "Bad form," he muttered, then turned. "We'll come back when the fire's lower." And they vanished into the trees. Mason turned to Junie. "He's stalling." "I know. We need to move tonight." "No." He frowned. "Why not?" Junie looked him dead in the eye. "Because he left something behind." Mason didn't understand, but then May screamed. He ran into the bedroom to find her standing by the window, pointing. A silver whistle lay on the sill. No footprints, no sound. Just the whistle. Mason grabbed it, turned it in his hand. It was warm. He tossed it into the stove. Junie turned to the girls. "Tonight we sleep in shifts. If you see anything, wake us." And so they waited. 1 hour passed. 2. Then around the 3rd, Mason stepped outside for wood. And came face to face with a woman. Not Junie. Not Ruthie. Not May. Just a woman, hooded, pale, standing by the woodshed. Her eyes were wrong, too calm. "Mason Creed?" she asked. He raised the axe. But before he could speak, she dropped a bundle at his feet. A letter. A photograph. And a ring. She stepped back into the dark. And vanished. Mason bent slowly. The letter was addressed to him. But the name signed at the bottom wasn't one he recognized. It simply read, "She's not the one you think she is." He didn't take the letter inside. Not right away. Mason crouched in the snow, fingers stiff around the paper, eyes locked on the name at the bottom. No signature, no mark beyond those 6 words burned into the parchment like a warning. "She's not the one you think she is." The photograph was older, worn at the corners, creased down the center. It showed 3 women, young, smiling, arms around one another near what looked like a dry goods store in some dusty town he couldn't name. He recognized one instantly. Ruthie, her eyes brighter than they were now, her hair tied back in a ribbon. The second was May. Even then she was quiet, her smile smaller. But the third. He stared harder. Junie. Only not Junie. Her hair was darker, her expression softer, and written on the back in faded pencil, "Me, Ruth, and Nora, 1877 Elderglen." Nora. Mason stood slowly. The ring still sat at the base of the bundle, small, gold, with an inscription on the inner band. He had to squint to read it. "To Nora, yours always, SV. Simon Vance." He pocketed the ring, tucked the photo back into the letter, and stood. The wind had picked up again, chasing flurries across the field. The woman who delivered it was gone, left no prints, no sound, but he felt her absence like a ghost's breath on his neck. Inside, the girls were asleep in a huddle by the hearth. Junie sat upright in a chair, the rifle across her lap, but her eyes were closed just for a second. Her body swayed with the weight of exhaustion. Mason didn't wake her, not yet. He sat at the table and unfolded the letter again. "You don't know who you let in, Mason Creed. She is not the woman she pretends to be. She ran, yes, but not because she feared Simon Vance. She feared what she did before she met him. She wasn't his prisoner. She was his partner until she was. She'll lie to you. She already has." There was no proof, no seal, no sign it wasn't just another mind game, but the photograph. He glanced at Junie. Her hand had twitched. She shifted slightly, murmured something in her sleep too low to catch. He should have burned the letter, should have thrown the ring into the fire with the whistle, but he couldn't. Not yet. He stayed awake the rest of the night, watching the windows. At some point, May stirred and sat beside him without a word. She didn't ask about the letter, didn't look at it, just reached out and rested her fingers on his sleeve. "Do you remember your mother?" he asked, surprising even himself. May shook her head. Then, after a pause, she tapped her fingers 3 times on the table. "Yes. She was kind." Another 3 taps. "Yes. She'd want you safe." No pause this time. "Yes." He nodded. "Then I guess we keep going." When Junie woke at dawn, she looked toward the door before anything else, then to the fire, then to the girls, finally to Mason. "They're still out there," she said. He didn't ask how she knew. He already believed her. Over breakfast, Ruthie found the ring. It had slipped from his coat pocket when he leaned over the stove. She picked it up, held it in the firelight. "Whose is this?" Junie turned, and for a moment, just a flicker, something raw passed through her eyes. She took the ring carefully as if it burned. "I haven't seen this in years," she whispered. Ruthie frowned. "It's yours." Junie hesitated. "It was mine once, a long time ago." Mason said nothing. Later, when the girls were outside gathering kindling, he cornered her in the pantry. "Who's Nora?" Junie froze. He watched her face carefully. She didn't deny it. "You read the letter." "I did." She nodded once, slow. "I thought I'd burned all the pictures." "You didn't. Someone brought one back." Junie leaned against the wall. Her face looked older suddenly, creases more defined, shadows deeper. "I was Nora once, before Simon, before I learned what men like him could turn a woman into." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because that woman made mistakes. She believed she could out-hustle the devil and walk away clean." "And Simon?" "He was my husband." Mason felt the weight of the truth settle like lead in his chest. "I thought I could tame him," she said. "I thought if I gave him just enough of what he wanted, he'd stop hurting the girls. I was wrong." Mason's voice was low. "You helped him." "Yes," she said. "And then I ran, and I took the ledger, the one with every name, every debt, every girl. I didn't do it for redemption. I did it because I was angry." "Is that why you came here?" Junie looked him in the eye. "I came here to kill him." Outside, the wind shifted again. A crow screamed overhead. Ruthie called something from the barn. Mason left Junie and stepped out. The girls had found a mark on the side of the shed. A circle. Inside it, a slash. It had been etched with a blade, fresh, bark still bleeding. "He's here," Mason said. Junie emerged from the house, rifle slung across her chest. "No more waiting," she said. "We draw him out." "How?" She pulled something from her coat, a second whistle. "I kept it," she said. "After I ran, I thought maybe one day I'd use it against him." Ruthie paled. "He'll come if you blow it." Junie nodded. "Good." That night they built a fire just outside the barn. Mason waited with the girls in the loft, rifle ready. Junie stood alone in the firelight, wind pulling at her hair, her coat open at the collar like she wasn't afraid of the cold. She blew the whistle. Once, twice, then waited. No answer. Then 30 minutes later, they saw him. He came from the north, tall and still like a shadow carved from ice. Behind him were 2 men, guns at their hips, but Simon walked ahead alone. He stopped a few paces from the fire. "Nora," he said. Junie didn't flinch. "Don't call me that." Simon's smile was slow. "You still wearing the ring?" She held it up, then threw it into the flames. "That was a wedding gift," he said. "So was the bruise on my jaw." Mason kept his aim steady from above. Ruthie didn't breathe. May clutched his arm so hard her nails broke skin. "You think hiding in the woods changes what you are?" Simon asked. Junie raised the rifle. "No, but it changes what I'll do." Simon tilted his head. "What happens to your little family when you miss?" "I won't. I taught you to shoot." Junie stepped forward. "You taught me to survive. I learned to shoot on my own." Simon drew his revolver slowly. The men behind him followed suit. Mason pulled the trigger. The first bullet hit Simon's arm. He spun, stumbled, dropped his gun. Junie fired next. One of the men went down with a scream. Ruthie leapt to her feet, tossed a lantern down. It shattered near the fire, flames licking up the dry grass. May screamed. The second man lunged for Junie. Mason jumped from the loft. They fought in the snow, fists and breath and blood. Mason took a punch to the jaw, heard a rib crack but kept swinging. Junie dropped the man with the butt of her rifle. Simon crawled toward his gun. Mason got there first. He kicked it away, then stood over him. Simon looked up, bleeding from the shoulder, his grin twisted. "You think killing me will fix her?" Mason didn't answer. Junie stepped forward, rifle aimed. Simon laughed. Then Mason stepped aside. "You're shot." Junie pulled the trigger. The echo rolled through the woods like thunder. Simon Vance didn't get up. They buried him near the ridge. No markers, no prayers. Junie stayed quiet most of the next day. Ruthie cried once, then stopped. May drew something new in the ash, a house, smoke from the chimney, no faces in the windows. Mason burned the second whistle, then the letter. And finally, the photograph. Junie didn't stop him. They sat together on the porch that evening. Snow still fell, but the wind was quieter. "You going to leave now?" she asked. Mason shook his head. "Not unless you ask me to." She didn't. The storm didn't break for 3 more days, and in that time the forest itself seemed to hold its breath. No new tracks, no fresh sounds. The trees stood heavy under their snow load, leaning in like quiet witnesses to everything that had been buried beneath them. The ridge where they buried Simon turned hard and flat with ice, and the girls didn't walk near it again. Neither did Mason, not because of guilt, because of finality. That grave wasn't a hiding place. It was a full stop. Junie didn't say much after that night, but she didn't have to. She moved differently, still careful, still sharp, but slower now, not weaker, just like someone who had finally put down a burden she'd carried across too many winters. She cleaned the rifle with more care. She watched the stove like it was a friend she hadn't trusted before. May started talking again, not in words. She still hadn't spoken a full sentence, but in sounds. A hum while she swept. A quiet when she liked something in the stew. It was enough. Ruthie had stopped waking up screaming. Her shoulders, always tight with fear, began to settle just slightly each time Mason spoke her name. It wasn't peace, but it was something close. Then came the telegram. It arrived in the hands of a man on a gray horse, wrapped in furs too clean for any honest woodsman. He rode straight to the edge of the cabin's field, dismounted, and waited there in the snow like he'd been told exactly how far to go and no farther. Mason stepped out first, rifle over his shoulder, hat low. The man didn't spook, just tipped his chin and held out the folded envelope. "Message," he said, "came by rail, paid in full by someone named E.B. out in Gallows Bend." Mason didn't know the initials, but Junie did. She stepped out behind him, her breath catching before the man even turned. "Edith," she murmured. The name hung there, heavy as ice. The writer didn't wait for questions. "Told to deliver this and nothing else. I don't know what it says, ma'am. I don't want to, but she said to tell you she's alive." Junie reached for the telegram like it might vanish if she blinked. Mason watched her fingers tremble as she broke the seal. She read it once. Then again. then folded it slowly and stared out across the snow, her jaw locked, her throat working around a knot of emotion so thick it made Mason's chest ache. "She's in trouble," Junie said. "Who?" "My sister." Mason blinked. "You never mentioned a sister." "I thought she was dead," Junie's voice cracked. "We got separated years ago. She stayed with Simon after I ran." "You think he hurt her?" "I think he married her." Mason didn't say what he was thinking, that they'd killed him, that she was free now. Because he saw it in Junie's eyes. This wasn't about escape anymore. This was about what came after. Ruthie and May came outside just as the rider mounted his horse. He looked down once, nodded politely, then turned and vanished down the trail like a whisper. Mason watched the spot where the trees swallowed him, then turned back to Junie. "What does she want?" "She didn't say," Junie answered, "but she wouldn't have written unless it was bad." Mason rubbed his face. "How far's Gallows Bend?" 3 days by sled, 4 if we bring the girls." Silence followed, then Ruthie stepped forward. "We're going with you," she said. May nodded once fiercely. Junie opened her mouth to argue, but stopped. She didn't try to shield them anymore, not after what they'd already survived. They packed quickly, supplies, tools, weapons. Mason reinforced the sled runners, checked the horses. The air had turned colder again, the kind that crept into your bones whether you moved or not, but no one complained, not even May. They left the next morning. The trail was narrow, cutting between frozen streams and stands of pine so tall the sun barely reached through. They passed no one, not a bird, not a rabbit, not a single other soul. Just silence, just the sound of their own breath fogging in the cold. On the second night, Ruthie asked Junie about Edith. "She was always braver than me," Junie said, voice soft over the campfire. "She didn't cry when Mama died, just held my hand and told me to keep moving." "And she married Simon." "After I left," Junie said. I think he told her I was dead. That's what he did. Twisted the truth until you didn't recognize yourself anymore." Mason stared into the fire. "What if it's a trap?" Junie met his eyes. "Then we spring it our way." On the third day, they reached the outskirts of Gallows Bend. It wasn't much of a town, 3 roads, a crooked steeple, and a train depot that looked like it'd collapse if someone sneezed too hard. But the sheriff's office still stood, and so did the hotel. Junie led them past both, straight to a house near the edge of the cemetery. The door was painted green. She knocked once, then twice, then 3 times. It opened slowly. The woman who stood there looked like Junie, but softer. Her hair was pinned up, her eyes ringed with tired lines, and she wore black like she'd never taken it off. "Eddie," Junie whispered. Edith didn't cry. She just stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her sister like she'd been holding that hug for 10 long years. Inside, the house was cold. No fire, no food. Mason noticed right away that the windows were nailed shut, and there were scratch marks on the floor near the back bedroom. Junie noticed too. "What happened?" she asked. Edith didn't speak for a long time. Then finally she sat down and said, "He's not dead." Mason froze. Junie's face went pale. "We buried him." Edith shook her head. "You buried someone, not him." Ruthie stepped closer to Mason. May didn't move, just stared at the closed door behind Edith. "He's here?" Junie asked. "No," Edith said. "He left 2 weeks ago, said he had unfinished business, said he'd be back." "Then who did we kill?" Mason asked. Edith stood and walked to a drawer, pulled out a photograph, handed it to Junie. "That's Jacob, his brother." Junie sank into a chair. "I thought he was an only child." Edith shook her head. "He lied about that, about everything." Mason rubbed the back of his neck. "If he's coming back." "He'll kill me," Edith said simply. "I've kept his secrets too long." Junie's voice hardened. Not if we get him first. But it wasn't that easy. That night, while they slept in the cold house with windows nailed shut, someone left a message carved into the back door. You missed. Nothing else. No footprints, no sounds. Just that. Mason didn't sleep after that. He stood by the door with the rifle across his chest, staring out into the darkness like it might answer back. And in the morning, he found a ring on the front step. Not Junie's. Edith's. She thrown it into the river years ago. Or so she thought. The inscription inside. To E, forever starts when you obey, SV. Junie picked it up with a gloved hand, didn't say a word. Because she didn't have to. The man they'd buried wasn't the man who'd ruined them. Simon Vance was still out there. And this time, he wasn't coming to talk. They didn't wait for sunrise. By the time the first pale light bled across the horizon, the 5 of them were already on the move again. Junie in front, rifle strapped across her back, her eyes sweeping every shadow like she expected one to reach out and drag her under. Edith followed behind, quiet, but with a strange tension in her steps that hadn't been there the day before. Ruthie and May rode in the sled, curled beneath blankets, clutching each other with the kind of silent strength that only came after too many nights of fear. Mason brought up the rear, hand never far from his holster, jaw clenched so tight it felt fused. They didn't talk about where they were going, not right away. It didn't matter, because something had shifted in the air the moment that second ring landed on the porch. There wasn't doubt anymore, just cold clarity. Simon Vance had known exactly where to find them, and he'd chosen not to come yet. That meant he was watching, waiting, and worse, it meant he still believed he had control. Junie wouldn't let that happen. He's always 3 steps ahead, she said, once they'd cleared the edge of town and were back beneath the black-limbed trees. That's how he works. He lets you think you're safe, then he cuts the ground out from under you. Mason nodded but didn't speak. He knew that kind of man, knew the games they played, and he also knew deep in his gut that this wasn't going to end in another grave beside a ridge. This would be blood on snow, and no one was walking away untouched. By mid-morning, the trail narrowed. Edith guided them off the main path, cutting west through a stretch of forest so thick it swallowed sound. There were no animal tracks, no bird calls, just silence, like the world was holding its breath. There's a cabin, she said softly, pointing ahead. Old hunting outpost. He used it when he didn't want anyone knowing where he'd gone. Is it safe? Mason asked. No, Junie answered for her. That's why we're going. The place came into view like a memory too sharp to forget. Half buried in snow, its roof sloped from time and neglect, the door sagging on one hinge. But it was dry, and it was defensible. Mason moved in first, sweeping each room, checking under the floorboards behind the stove. Nothing, but the ashes in the hearth were recent. Someone had been there within days. He's already come through, he muttered. Edith didn't look surprised. He always circles back to places he's tainted. Junie pulled the girls close, set them near the wall farthest from the door. Then she unwrapped a folded cloth from her coat. Inside were 5 bullets. One had a red mark on the casing. Mason frowned. That one's different. It's his, Junie said. He made me carry it, said if I ever used it, it'd be on myself. She loaded it into the chamber without hesitation. Night came fast in the woods. By 5, the trees had turned into black spires and the wind had begun its slow wail through the branches. The fire burned low. No one slept. Around midnight, Ruthie gasped. Mason sat up instantly. What is it? She pointed to the window. A figure. Far off, just beyond the trees. Still. Watching. Junie stepped toward the window, but Mason stopped her. I'll go. No, she said. He's not here to kill, not yet. He's testing us, Edith murmured, seeing how far we've come. Mason paced the room once, then stood with his back to the door. Then we make it clear we're not running. An hour passed. The figure didn't move. Then just before dawn it was gone. No tracks. No sign. Just a single carved message on the tree nearest the window. You think you're ready, you're not. Junie read it once, then spat in the snow. The storm broke that night. Not of snow, but of silence, of waiting. Mason felt it before he heard anything. The hairs along the back of his neck stood up as if something unseen had stepped just close enough to disturb the stillness. He stood at the edge of Edith's porch, boots planted firm, rifle slung forward. The others were inside, behind windows that still bore scratches from hands or claws or blades. He didn't know, didn't ask. He only knew Junie's breathing had changed when she saw those marks. Not fear, not surprise, recognition. Inside, Edith hadn't spoken since they found the ring. She stayed close to the stove, building a fire that didn't seem to give off heat. Ruthie and May had gone quiet again, reading Junie's stillness like gospel. They knew how to read the room now, how to prepare for something before it showed up. They'd grown too good at it. That night Mason couldn't sleep. He paced from one window to the next, watched the sky, watched the street, watched Junie, who sat in the kitchen with the letter from Edith still folded in her lap. He wanted to ask her what she was thinking, but something about the way her fingers curled tightly around the edge of that page kept him quiet. She wasn't just thinking about Simon. She was remembering him, remembering what it felt like to think she'd ended a chapter only to find out the book was still wide open. Then came the sound. Not a knock, not a bang. A whistle. Long and slow and flat, like air escaping something old. It came from just outside the window nearest the back of the house. Mason stiffened. Junie was already on her feet before he could reach the door. He motioned for her to stay back, but she didn't listen. She never did, not when it mattered. They stepped out together. The snow crunched beneath their feet untouched until now. But something had moved. Mason could feel it, could smell it in the air, a hint of smoke, a trace of something coppery wrong, and then he saw it. Etched into the snow near the porch, a single word in boot-tracked letters, dragged by heel. Again. Junie's breath fogged beside him. He's here. I don't see anyone. He doesn't want to be seen, not yet. Ruthie opened the door behind them. The fire just went out. Mason turned fast. What? The stove, it's dead cold. I stoked it less than an hour ago, Junie said. Edith's voice called from the other room, shaky and thin. He's inside. They ran. Junie grabbed May first, sweeping her into her arms just as the lamp in the corner shattered. Ruthie ducked as glass exploded across the floor. Mason burst into the front room, rifle raised, but found only open air and shadows. Edith stood at the far corner of the kitchen, pale, her hands trembling. I felt him, she whispered, like a hand on my shoulder, then it was gone. Doors were locked. Junie shook her head. He doesn't need doors, not if someone lets him in. Her eyes fell to the hearth. The fire wasn't just cold, it was wet. Mason stepped closer. Ash was soaked, the iron belly of the stove hissing with moisture, as if someone had poured water through from the chimney itself. Not snow, water, measured, intentional. He's playing, Mason muttered. Junie turned to Edith. You still have the ledger. Edith hesitated, then slowly nodded. Where? Edith didn't move. Junie stepped closer. Eddie, where? Edith reached into the cabinet below the flour tins and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She handed it over like it was poison. Mason unwrapped it. It was thinner than he expected. Bound in cracked leather, the pages yellowed and dry, but the names inside, Mason saw towns he recognized, saw the names of girls he didn't, ages, payments, crossed out entries marked with stars. Then he found Junie's name. And Edith's. and Ruthie S. and Mays. But there were more. Some of these girls, Mason said slowly, they're still alive. Junie nodded once. I think so. Then this isn't just a ledger. This is a list of every secret Simon's ever kept. And the ones he'd killed to bury. Edith's voice was barely audible. That's why he came back. He knows it's still here. Mason looked at the door, then to Junie. We have to move. We can't outrun him. We don't have to, Mason said. We just have to end this before he takes another girl. They left the next morning. Not through the town, not through the depot. Mason led them along the riverbank down a path marked only by old trapper stones. The wind was sharp but not brutal. It howled less than it had the week before. The trees swayed but didn't groan. Still, none of them relaxed. They reached the old church by midday. It had burned down years ago. Stories said lightning, but Mason had always heard whispers about something else. A girl buried in the floorboards. A man who never showed his face again. Whatever the truth, the foundation still stood. And the basement. Stone steps led down into a space where pews once stood and ashes still clung to the stones. They made camp there. Ruthie helped build the fire. May stood guard with a hatchet bigger than her arm. Edith curled up in one of the corners, flinching at every creak above them. Mason pulled Junie aside. Do you trust her? He asked. Junie didn't answer at first. I trust what she's lost, she said finally, and I trust what I saw in her eyes when she handed over that book. Which is desperation, and desperation doesn't lie, it just begs. That night Mason couldn't sleep again. He sat with the ledger open in his lap, turning each page like a priest reading confessionals, and then he found it. The last entry. A girl named Lenora. Age 14. Location Cranes Hollow. Status returned. Returned. He showed Junie. She paled. That's where he's going. Cranes Hollow was 2 days east. They had supplies for maybe one, but they didn't hesitate. At sunrise they moved. The woods turned sharper the deeper they went. Less snow, more bone-cold earth, the trees closer like ribs around something vital, and then they heard the sound. Not a whistle. A song. Faint off-key, a girl's voice humming. They stopped. Lenora, Ruthie whispered. The song stopped. Then came the scream. High, piercing, young. Mason didn't wait, he ran. The trees parted into a clearing, and there, crouched at the edge of a half-frozen stream, was a girl with a sack over her head, arms bound behind her. Blood streaked the snow near her knees. Junie caught up just as Mason cut the ropes. Lenora collapsed into his arms, gasping, fingers clawing at his coat like she didn't believe he was real. Her mouth moved without sound. Then her eyes widened in terror. Mason turned. Simon stood 20 feet away, coat torn, eyes wild, grin red with cold. You shouldn't have come, he said. Junie stepped in front of Mason. You're done. Mason studied her face in the moonlight. You have a plan. She smiled. Not wide, not kind. A smile forged in fire. I will. It wasn't an accident. Junie struck the match herself, holding the fragile stem between thumb and forefinger as if testing her own resolve. The book sat open atop a pile of dry kindling, its spine cracked, pages loose from the bindings. It had been read, reread, copied, and shared in whispers with women too tired to cry any more and too angry to stay quiet. By the time the flames reached the names, Junie didn't flinch. Neither did the others. Mason stood beside her, arms crossed, eyes on the crackling pages. Ruthie and May watched from the porch steps, their legs swinging lightly, boots brushing the dirt. Edith held Lenora's hand near the edge of the yard, far enough not to feel the heat, but close enough to see every last letter curl into smoke. They'd memorized every entry. The ledger had done its job. Now it was time to start new pages. The fire burned hot and fast. When it was done, only ash remained. No spine, no corners, no trace. Just smoke carried by wind into the hills. Junie watched until the final ember died, then knelt and buried what was left. Not to forget, but to mark the end. That same night, she found Luther again. He'd returned to Gallows Bend of his own will, walking the old train lines with a knapsack over one shoulder and guilt under the other. Junie met him halfway across the old bridge, rifle slung but not raised. The boy stopped when he saw her. "I came to help," he said. "You already helped. I didn't do anything. You didn't pull the trigger. I didn't stop him." Junie studied his face. Still too young to carry the weight of the things he'd seen, but old enough now to know it wouldn't ever leave him. She walked closer and handed him a tin cup of warm broth. "You hungry?" He nodded. She led him back without another word. They gave him the barn to sleep in, same as they had Ruthie once. Mason didn't say much when he saw the boy, just handed him a pile of blankets and walked away. Edith made him stew. May drew him a picture. Lenora stared for a long while before finally sitting beside him. She didn't speak, but she didn't run either. Progress. The next morning, Mason brought in 3 letters from the post station. One was addressed to Junie in a thick, careful script. She read it by the window, the others too polite or too afraid to ask what it said. When she finally folded it, her eyes stayed on the road. "It's time," she said. Mason looked up. "Time for what?" "For the others." She passed him the letter. It was from a woman in Stag Run. She'd seen one of the names on the list posted in the general store window, part of a larger message scribbled in charcoal. "You are not alone." The woman signed only her initials, but her letter told enough. About girls gone missing, about a sheriff too scared to ask questions, and a preacher's son who smiled too much when girls walked by. Junie tucked the letter into her satchel. "We ride at first light." They didn't ask who would stay behind. None of them were. They moved in pairs now, Junie and Mason, Ruthie and May, Edith and Lenora. Luther stayed with the animals, helping fix the coop and clean tools. He didn't talk much. Didn't need to. His guilt showed in every act of care. Guilt, they'd all learned, could rot a person if left alone too long. But if pointed toward something useful, something good, it could build a new kind of strength. On the ride to Stag Run, the air was clear. Trees parted to let them through. No birds, no snow, but something louder than both, silence without fear. They passed 3 towns. At each, Junie left a name. Not a warning, a signal. They reached Stag Run by sundown. The preacher's son was already gone. Junie left a letter with the sheriff, didn't wait for him to read it. They moved on. More letters followed. One from Lily in Bitter Hollow. Her younger cousin had disappeared last spring. Another from Ruth in Crosswater. 3 girls missing from the boarding home. Each town had a story. Each woman had a name. And every time Junie read one aloud, it stopped being a secret. They reached Waverly and found a girl hiding in the crawlspace under the schoolhouse. She couldn't speak above a whisper, but when Ruthie held her hand, the girl squeezed back. In one town, they found a grave with no name. In another, a name with no grave. They wrote both down. Mason built coffins where none had been. Junie carved initials where no one had remembered. The nights were hard, but the mornings always came. By the 6th week, they'd ridden more miles than Mason could count. The map tacked to the inside of Junie's satchel had grown full of marks, not just for places they'd been, but for ones they still needed to go. Names circled in charcoal, roads traced with red twine. Edith started writing again. Not in a ledger, in letters. She mailed them to every girl she remembered. Some replies came, Some didn't. One came folded in a square of fabric stitched into the lining, a piece of paper that simply read, "He never came back." Junie framed it. One night, Mason found her staring at it in the firelight. "You believe that?" he asked. Junie didn't look up. "No." "You think he's dead?" "I think Simon doesn't die easy." "You afraid?" Junie folded the letter gently and slid it back into the frame. "No, I just don't want the girls who write to believe it's over when it's not." Mason sat down beside her. "What happens when we do find him?" Junie didn't speak, but Mason saw her hands curl into fists. He didn't press. Weeks became months. Seasons shifted. The cold dulled, rain returned, green pushed up through old snow. And one morning, Mason woke before dawn to find Junie already saddled. "You going alone?" he asked. Junie shook her head. "I found something," she said. He stepped beside her. Darkness waited beneath. Junie didn't hesitate. She climbed down. And behind her, every girl who had ever been taken, every voice that had ever gone unheard followed. Together, into the dark.